Chapter 91 Bad News. I don't want it. Jianyun stared straight ahead, not even bothering to entertain herself by glancing at the direction of the jewelry box. After everything that had happened back at his office, there was no way she was going to keep that necklace. The last thing she needed was more criticism and snide comments from Huo Lianqing. Even his name was enough to cause a stir in her chest. Are you stupid? Why don't you want it? Wu Wenjing poked her on the forehead, looking at her friend as if she had just suddenly grown an arm. If you don't want it, then you can sell it. Imagine the money we'd get. We'd never have to work for another day in our lives. Wu Wenjing was so excited that she was practically prancing across the room. Her heels were tapping excitedly across the tiles, and her hands were clasped together. Although her presence filled the room, her mind had already floated to a mountain filled with gold. If they were to sell the necklace, then she'd probably be lying on that same mountain today. To whom will we sell it? Jianyun glanced sideways, laughing at her naivety. Who'd even have the nerve to buy it from us? That's true. It's such a precious diamond, so to sell it to just any jewelry store would be difficult. At the thought, her shoulders sagged in defeat. Suddenly, the mountain of gold faded into the back of her mind as she sighed in contempt. It seemed that the road to victory wasn't so easy as she had thought. Shaking her head, Jianyun leaned back against her seat. She had also thought about selling the necklace every once in a while, and the process was difficult. Even if they dared to sell such a piece of expensive jewelry, ordinary stores wouldn't be able to buy them. And for those who could afford it, would have trouble believing that a pair of women in their mid-20s could own such a valuable thing. In fact, the worst-case scenario would be for them to ring up the police. If the police were contacted, then they would definitely contact Huo Lianqing, the original owner, to confront them. That would certainly dig them an early grave. Just leave it for now. We can talk about it later. She sighed, not knowing what else to do. It's not like Jianyun could just throw it away, but if she kept it within arm's reach, her blood would boil and her eyes would narrow in rage. At this point, it was like being stuck between a rock and a hard place. While she was speaking, Jianyun was actually already typing out her resignation letter. However, just as she was about to send it to Xia Bingbing, her phone suddenly rang out, echoing across her small cubicle. She paused and glanced at the screen. It was an unfamiliar number, although it did say that the number was located in Qinghu City. Not thinking too much into it, she directly swiped the answer button and placed it on her ear. Hello? Is this Miss Jian? A man's voice sounded from the other end of the line. It was very unfamiliar, and there was a certain trepidation in his voice that made her freeze. This is her. May I ask who's calling? Her eyes twitched. Someone wants to speak to you. The person didn't say anything more, and handed the phone to someone else. Yin, are you free now? It was Auntie Chin, and her voice sounded urgent. Upon hearing the old woman's wobbly voice, Jianyun could feel her chest tightening in worry. Auntie Chin, did something happen? What's wrong? We're at Qinghu City First Hospital. Listen to me. Your mom fell off the bed, and... Before the old woman could finish her sentence, she heard a sound similar to a phone crashing onto the tiled floor. And the next thing she knew, the line had been disconnected. Immediately, right after that, Jianyun rushed out of the office with absolutely no hesitation. She had no idea who she had gotten out of the company or how she had called the taxi, but the next thing she knew, she was already standing at the lobby of Qinghu City First Hospital. Her mind had gone blank upon seeing the number of hospital beds being reeled in and out of the rooms, and she couldn't help but wonder if her own mother was also sitting at one of those very same hospital beds, fighting for her life. Don't worry, Auntie will be fine. Wu Wenjing grabbed a hold of her friend's hand. When Jianyun had rushed out of the building, she was so worried that she followed her all the way out into the exit. She didn't really need to know the details to know that Mrs. Jian was in trouble. I'm here for you. You'll be fine. Jianyun's lips were as white as snow, and her hands were trembling on her sides. She tried to take out her phone from her bag multiple times, but she couldn't even unlock the clasp. Her shoulders sagged in defeat as her eyes narrowed. It won't open, she desperately repeatedly murmured to herself. It just won't happen. Let me do it. Wu Wenjing calmly took out Jianyun's phone from her pockets. She had seen her friend enter the password multiple times, so she knew it like the back of her hand. Once she had it opened, she dialed the number that had just called them a couple of minutes ago. The phone rang multiple times before the man had finally picked up. Hello? Who is this? His words sounded a bit muffled, and Wu Wenjing could hear a few other voices ringing from the background. It was obvious that the man was in the middle of something, but she simply held her ground. You're the one who just called us, right? You're Miss Jian? The man snapped his fingers from the memory, before nodding. So you've already arrived at the hospital? Your aunt is on the 3rd floor. Remember to head straight to the operating room. Thanks. Without extending the conversation, Wu Wenjing hung up the phone and led Jianyun to the elevator. Jianyun could only grab her friend's hand. She had wanted to say something, anything, to calm herself or her friend, but whenever she tried to, her lips would simply tremble, and no words would come out. At this point, she was already at a loss of what to do. Her hands shook as millions of thoughts rushed through her mind as she wondered what had happened. Don't worry. Wu Wenjing held her even tighter. She'll be fine. Everything will be fine. They arrived on the third floor very quickly, and the moment the elevator doors opened, Jian Yun could see Auntie Chin sitting on the bench. The old woman looked frail and shaky under her large cardigan and oversized shirt, looking as if she had just run all the way down to the hospital. The wrinkles around her eyes were more prominent and sunken, and it was obvious that she was under a ton of stress. Yun, you're finally here. The moment Auntie Chin saw them, she immediately rushed over and was about to kneel down. I am sorry. Don't apologize, it wasn't your fault. Jian Yun was quick to support her, holding the old woman up and helping her to her seat. Wu Wenjing took the initiative in asking, Auntie, what happened? It was all my fault. I left to dump the trash out in the other block. It usually takes around 10 minutes or less. Auntie Chin paused, taking time to breathe. Tears were continuously running down her cheeks. No matter how much she struggled to hold it in, they just kept rushing out, making it even worse. And then, when I came back, she had fallen off the bed. It's my fault. I didn't take good care of her, and now? Where's my mom? Jian Yun's mind was filled with questions, but she didn't really know where to start. She's in the operating room right now. Wiping her tears, Auntie Chin motioned to the double doors at the other end of the corridor. There, the lights were turned on, signaling that the patient was already being operated. As she stared at the closed doors, Jian Yun felt as if her legs were being filled with lead, rendering her unable to move. Her fingers twitched, trying to pry herself to the seat. But she could only stumble forward. Mom, she thought, clutching her chest. Just the thought of her mother suffering alone once more made her heart hurt. Yun, why don't you sit down first? Wu Wenjing helped her to a chair. Auntie's very lucky. I'm sure she'll be fine. However, her comfort was to no avail. Jian Yun was so overwhelmed with anxiety that her brain had gone numb. It was as if everything around her had disappeared into the background, and all she could see were those double doors looming over her. For her mother to come to First Qinghu City Hospital, her injuries must have been so severe that the Boshan Hospital was unwilling to accept her. That was why she came all the way to Qinghu City. Mom, she murmured to herself, hearing her hollow voice echoing across the corridor. She couldn't imagine what she'd do if anything were to happen to her mother. Time had passed by second, but Jian Yun felt as if she had been sitting there for years. She felt like a statue, hardened on her seat with eyes as glassy and as unblinking as a doll sitting on a shelf. The sounds of beeping and footsteps had fallen deaf to her ears as she waited, with every minute sending a thrum of anxiety through her veins. At this point, that was all she could do anyway. When the double doors were pushed open, she stiffened. Is Ouyang Fei's family here? A nurse stood by the doorway, looking in the direction of the waiting area. Her lips were pursed. Jian Yun didn't move an inch. It was as if her entire body had been drenched by a bucket of ice water, and she couldn't bring herself to get up. That was her mother. Was she going to receive good news or bad news? Her fingers twitched, and her eyelids shook. At the sight of the nurse's indifferent stare, she grew even more terrified of the answer that was awaiting her. Ouyang Fei's family member, she repeated. Here! Wu Wenjing hurriedly stood up and waved her hand. Just take a look at the contract and sign it, the nurse said urgently, pushing the clipboard towards her. Let's go. Wu Wenjing pulled her friend over to the nurse and received the surgical consent form. However, as Jian Yun grasped the pen, she couldn't sign properly, and the pen could only helplessly slip out her grasp every time she tried. At this point, even her actions led to fruitless results. You need to sign it quickly, or the doctor wouldn't be able to perform the surgery. The nurse tapped her foot with anticipation, looking at her slowed movements. At the sight of this, even she couldn't help but be a little anxious. The patient was already delayed on the way here, so the operation must be carried out immediately. Nurse, she's the daughter of the patient. Wu Wenjing motioned to Jian Yun. Her friend was practically on the verge of collapsing, with her pale face and blue lips. Holding on to her, she grabbed the pen in her stead. Look at her state. Can I just sign it for her? What's your relationship with the patient? The nurse hesitated. The patient is my aunt, Wu Wenjing said automatically. At this point, that was the only excuse that she could hold up. With Jian Yun's weak condition, she couldn't even bring herself to sign the contract, and like the nurse had said, they couldn't afford any delays. Well, can I sign it now? Let her sign it. Immediately, the door to the operating room was pushed open once again, and a man in a green surgical suit came walking out. Director Bai. The nurse greeted him before nodding, letting Wu Wenjing sign her name onto the consent form. Doctor, how's my mother? Jian Yun finally found her voice as she brought herself to walk towards him. The male doctor was around half a head taller than her, so she had to tilt her head up to properly look at him. Chapter 92 Resignations. Your mother's suffering from a cerebral hemorrhage. As of now, her condition is unstable, and we need to undergo craniotomy immediately. The male doctor was wearing a mask this entire time, so Jian Yun couldn't really see him too clearly. However, his voice was gentle, and he looked very young given the lack of lines across his eyes. As he stared at her, he raised his eyebrows amicably. But don't worry, we'll do our best, I swear on it. However, this wasn't the time to make small talk anymore. Once he had gotten the consent form, he quickly made his way into the operating room. When the doors slammed shut behind him, she could feel the tendrils of her heart getting all tangled up once more. Her fingernails dug into her palms in anxiety as tension settled inside of her. At the thought of these doctors opening her mother's skull, her entire body had gone limp. It was weird to think how such a strong-willed woman could once again fall victim to the hands of fate once again. If it weren't for Wu Wenjing supporting her from the sidelines, Jian Yun would have already collapsed to the ground. The nurse who had handed them the consent form quickly asked them to pay for the bills. It was Wu Wenjing who ran up to the counter and paid it for the meantime. Once she had signed the receipts, she quickly made her way back to the bench to calm her friend down. Yin, you have to listen to me. You must stay strong now for her. I'm sure she'd be devastated if she sees you like this. Seeing the dazed look on her friend's face, Wu Wenjing became even more anxious. She sat beside her and placed an arm around her shoulders. It will all be fine. I'm sure your mother is fighting her way through the operation as we speak. Like I said, you and your mother had always been fighters, and there's no way you're going down on this one. That's right, Yun. Your mother's counting on you. Auntie Chin leaned against the young woman, wrapping her arms around her. You can't just give up like this. Jin Yun closed her eyes and took a few deep breaths, trying her best to relax. Although her nerves were still a bit tight after what had happened, she knew that Wu Wenjing and Auntie Chin were right. If something were to happen to her now, then her mother's state would have been even more helpless. She would have wanted me to be strong for her, she told herself, straightening her back. As the operation progressed, she gradually calmed down. Right now, the operation had floated to the back of her mind as another major question settled inside her. How had her mother fallen out of the bed all by herself? Auntie Chin, do you mind explaining in detail what exactly happened this morning? She asked again. Auntie Chin wiped the tears with the back of her hand before explaining. This morning, I pushed your mother around the park to get a bit of vitamin D as usual. Then we went to the market to buy some vegetables. She paused, sniffling. When we got home, your mother started saying how tired she was and how much she wanted to lie down for a while, so I helped her to bed. Once I've cleaned the vegetables, I went out to empty our bin. It usually takes me 10 minutes or less, but when I returned, the door was wide open. The next thing I know, little Fei was lying on the floor with blood smeared across her head. The door was wide open? Jian Yun furrowed her eyebrows, going straight to the point. Did you close the door on your way out? I always close the door when I go out, so it's weird to see it open like that. Auntie Chin's face was marred with guilt. It took me a long time to take out the trash as well. Usually, it would have taken me 3 to 4 hours to dump the trash, but someone had stopped over to ask me for directions. I must have been distracted and... Jian Yun and Wu Wenjing shared a look. For Mrs. Jian to have fallen so suddenly on the same day when Auntie Chin was throwing out the trash, something about this sounded way too coincidental for their taste. As soon as I came back, Fei was already unconscious. Auntie Chin looked down, twiddling her thumbs. I remembered calling the ambulance, and I remembered just sprinting all the way here. I must have lost my phone on the way. And I remembered telling the doctor about her condition, how she was injured and internally bleeding, but I just can't understand him. All I know was that I needed to call you, and I'm so sorry. This is all my fault. If I had just been a little more attentive. The older woman sobbed and buried herself deeper into her hands. Auntie, this isn't your fault. Jian Yun knew for a fact that Auntie Chin had always taken care of her mother as if she was her own sister. And if there was someone who was at fault here, it certainly wasn't her, especially after what she had done for them. However, Jian Yun still couldn't let this issue go so easily. Wait, when you got back in the house, has anything been misplaced? Anything unusual? I didn't have the time to check the things in the house, but when I got back inside, I noticed that the lock was broken, Auntie Chin said uneasily, and everything else is in disarray. Did you contact the police? Yes, one of our neighbors heard what had happened, and when she saw me and Fei, she helped us inform the police. A thought occurred to her, and Auntie Chin grabbed her hands, furrowing her eyebrows. Yun, do you think your mother's fall wasn't an accident? Do you think someone had broken in and pushed her? Although Jian Yun didn't say anything, Wu Wenjing interjected for her. Auntie usually relies on people to help her climb in and out of bed. Even if she had some urgent matters to attend to, she still would have waited for Auntie Chin to return. She crossed her arms over her chest. Plus, even if she had fallen out of bed, it still wouldn't have been severe enough to cause a hemorrhage. What do you think, Yun? I wonder if the police have any results. Jian Yun frowned. But we can't go back now, and I still don't know where my phone is. Maybe I can call our neighbor to see if she has any updates? Auntie Chin offered dejectedly. Let's not talk about this for now. We'll see after your mother's surgery. Wu Wenjing placed a hand on their shoulders. If not, I'll run over that house and see what's really going on. Jian Yun nodded. Although she had wanted to find out more answers, this was really all she could do for now. When Jian Yun and Wu Wenjing had arrived at the hospital, it was way past 1 o'clock. Now, it was already 3. Somehow the time had passed even more slowly at the hospital. Almost 2 hours had passed, and the surgery still wasn't over. As she sat by the bench, watching various hospital beds being pushed back and forth, she couldn't help but feel a little overwhelmed by them. While they were waiting, Wu Wenjing had received a call from her colleague, Sister Xiao. When they left the office, they had asked Sister Xiao specifically to help them request a leave of absence. I tried to ask it from Xia Bingbing, but all she did was rage at me because you didn't ask her personally, she carefully said. She wanted you to return immediately. Otherwise, she'll be deducting your bonuses for the month. Are you kidding me? Wu Wenjing slammed her hands against the table. She immediately made a phone call to Xia Bingbing herself, and after cursing the heck out of the woman, she quickly announced her resignation. When she mentioned her resignation, Jian Yun suddenly remembered that she had left in a hurry. She hadn't turned off her computer, and the report she had typed in was still in her drafts. Hey, do you mind asking Sister Xiao to turn off my computer? She turned to Wu Wenjing. At this point, she still hadn't finished her letter, so she could only wait this out to figure out her next step. What she didn't know was that when both of them had left, Hui had deliberately passed by Jian Yun's desk and swept her eyes over her belongings. After seeing that the woman had typed up a resignation letter, she had immediately sent it to Xia Bingbing. At this point, a mocking smile slipped into the janitor's lips. The moment that Xia Bingbing had received the resignation letter, she was practically jumping across the department floor in ecstasy. She didn't waste any time as she forwarded it to the CEO's office for his approval. Curling her fingers across the edges of her desk, the corners of her lips inched up into a mocking smile. It seemed that she had finally succeeded in driving that bitch away. While Jian Yun was anxiously waiting at the door of the operating room, Cheng Muzhe was trying not to freeze inside the CEO's office. The tension in the room was so strong that he was finding it hard to breathe. Guo Liancheng leaned back against his reclining chair, and his lips were pursed into a cold smile. His handsome face that was once a light under the sun had now darkened immensely. The screen blared across his face, creating a shadow around his jaw. His cold eyes were fixated on the names displayed in front of him. Cheng Muzhe raised his eyebrows. Fourth brother, you've already clearly kicked her out of the company and told her to never appear in front of you ever again, he said provokingly. Now that Sister Jan's following your wishes, you should be happy, right? Why do you look like you've lost the lottery? He ignored him and shut off his computer. If you have nothing else to say, then get out, Huo Liancheng snapped. However, Cheng Muzhe didn't back down. Not only didn't he follow his orders, but he also sat on the chair with his legs crossed. However, I have to say, Sister Jian has a lot of spunk. Back then, I thought that she rejected you because she was playing hard to get, he teased, pushing his glasses up the bridge of his nose. I didn't think that it's because she's actually uninterested in you. I like the way she thinks. Huo Liancheng squinted dangerously at him. Usually, others would have taken this as a sign to quiet down, but Cheng Mu's was already on a roll. Imagine you, China's wealthiest man, was rejected. Chapter 93. A young fool who has just fallen in love. Cheng Mu's was about to burst into laughter when a shadow suddenly hovered across him. The next thing he knew, he found himself rocking back against his seat. The corner of his lips throbbed in pain, and he quickly held the side of his face, looking like a child who had been wronged. Just as he was about to speak again, another punch flew towards him, and he ducked his head. Holy shit! You're serious about this? Although he had reacted quickly. The pain in his jaw was still unbearable. Panting, he stood up from his seat with a hand still cradling his jaw. It has always been like this. Whenever I say something you weren't ready to hear, you'd punch me like a child. Grow the hell up. If you don't agree with me, then why don't you just hit me? Huo Liancheng had already untangled his tie and tossed it onto the table. Striding across the office, he grabbed Chen Mu's by the collar with one hand as his other hand was raised up in the air. His face had morphed into a makeshift snarl. Well? If you have something to say, then just say it. I'm not here to fight with you. Cheng Muzhe had already slipped from his grasp from a fish. The man had wanted to race towards the exit when Huo Liancheng quickly restrained him, forcing Cheng Muzhe to face him. I've already said what I came here to say, okay? Ever since they were young, he had never been able to defeat Huo Liancheng in an actual physical fight, and now was no different. Seeing as he had no other choice, he immediately sat on the ground and played dead. I said I'm not going to fight you, he snapped, crossing his arms like a little boy. Do you want me to die or something? The sweat beaded down Huo Liancheng's face. Adrenaline had rushed down his veins, and his fists were clenched. If there were any other man standing before him, they would have already peed their pants. If you really don't want Sister Jian to leave, then why don't you just go and chase her? Why do you have to vent your anger on me, of all people? Cheng Mu scowled, resisting the urge to smack some sense into his cousin's head. Normally, Huo Liancheng would have been the last man to throw punches these days, being the more mature one in the group. Who would have thought that he'd become so childish and irrational after meeting Jian Yun? Do you want to go another round? You know what, fourth bro? I changed my mind. Chen Wu's quickly jumped out from his seat. Turns out I still have lots of work to do. I'll be going out first. Without another word, he rushed out of the office. Huo Liancheng, on the other hand, had gone into the bathroom to cool off. He turned on the tap and stuck his head under the faucet, rinsing the heat off with cold water. The flushness of his face had receded, and the cold look in his eyes had remained. It was only after a long while did he finally raise his face and look at himself in the mirror. Wiping his face with the back of his hand, a bitter smile slipped into his lips. He had gone through a lot to find her. Originally, he had wanted to just give himself some closure, to untie the knot that had been stuck in his heart for so many years. How could he have known that he'd fall in love with her all over again? Was this just how fate worked? Did he really have to go through all this trouble again? Yet, there was something different about her. Jian Yun was no longer the lively woman she used to be. Instead, she had grown more solemn and reserved, as if reality had sucked out the joy she had left in her veins. However, there was something about her sincerity that left him even more fascinated with her. She was like a piece of unpolished jade. With every move she made, it always gave him a pleasant surprise. And with every rejection he took, it only seemed to have made him want her even more. What he didn't get was why she'd rather date a gay man than actually be with him, of all the people in the world. She had already made it clear to him that she wasn't the same girl he had left behind. As far as he had known, she must have already had a few other boyfriends on her list. However, when he saw her wandering between several men while lying to him non-stop, he could help but feel a little jealous, wondering when she finally recognized him for who he was. When he saw her together with her first love, he had never felt so cold. It was as if someone had thrown him into a pool of iced cold water, and all he could do was watch as the man held her in his arms as if she was his to begin with. That was why he was angry, to the point where he had said those cruel words without even thinking. Huo Liancheng took a towel and wiped off the tap water from his forehead. Although he was still unsettled, Chen Wu's was right. His actions a few hours ago were indeed childish. He wasn't the CEO who had flipped hundreds of companies anymore. No. He was a young fool who had just fallen in love. The shame was evident in his features. At the same time, in Qinghu City First People's Hospital, 3.5 hours had passed, and the lights in the operating room were still turned on. Jian Yun was practically burning with anxiety at this point. The short heels tapped against the tiles with every second that had passed. At this point, she was afraid that she'd burn a hole into the floor, with how many times she had skidded her heels across the tiles. Closing her eyes, she could only wish that the operation had gone well. Fortunately, the door to the operating room had been pushed open 10 minutes later. A slender doctor walked out with a nurse following right behind him. Jian Yun immediately rushed over, but as soon as she was stared down by the professionals, she found herself at a loss for words. She could only stare at the male doctor with her large glassy eyes. It was Wu Wenjing who had finally taken the initiative to ask, "Doctor, how is my aunt? Is she okay? Did the operation go well?" The male doctor finally took off his mask and glanced at Jian Yun. The sincerity was clear in his eyes, and he replied, "The operation was successful. As long as her vitals remain normal in the next 48 hours, your mother will be fine." Upon hearing his words, she heaved a sigh of relief. The hard grip she had on her clothes had loosened. After 3 hours, it was as if a weight had been lifted off her shoulders, and she suddenly had the urge to cry. "Thank you, doctor." Wu Wenjing and Auntie Chin celebrated as they bowed their heads, thanking the doctor and the nurse profusely. "Director Bai is one of our best neurologists, one of the top 3 in the country," the nurse behind him added, smiling at the relatives. "You really had nothing to worry about. Your mother was in good hands, and she still is." Director Bai chuckled upon hearing the nurse's compliments. Although they were a bit exaggerated for his taste, he couldn't deny that his status could grant comfort and reassurance to his patients and their families. It was certainly a plus, upon seeing the relieved smiles that were now plastered on their faces. "When your mother had been transferred here, I didn't bring that much money with me," Auntie Chin explained. "The hospital only allowed immediate surgery for your mother because Director Bai had given guaranteed for us. He's the one who lent me his phone to inform you as to what had happened." "I thank you." Jian Yun slowly raised her head, thanking him sincerely. "It really doesn't matter." Director Bai waved his hand dismissively, looking straight at her. Her tears hadn't dried yet, and it made her eyes look even glassier, especially under the bright lights in the hospital. It made him even more unable to take his eyes off them. "Your mother is still recuperating in the ICU. You can't visit her until she wakes up. Why don't you go back and rest first?" At his suggestion, she quickly shook her head. "I'm not going back. It's best if I wait here instead, just in case she wakes up." "Yun, it would be useless if you stay here," Hu Wenjing advised. "Why don't you come back and rest first? Otherwise, how will you take care of Auntie when she wakes up?" "She's right, Yun," Auntie Chin agreed. Why don't you take Auntie Chin back first? I just need to be closer to my mom. She didn't even lift her head. Please?" "Fine." Not wanting to argue with her any longer, Wu Wenjing sighed. "I'll take Auntie Chin to eat first, then I'll come to find you later. Okay?" Once they were gone, Jianyun looked back at Director Bai. Director Bai, where's the ICU? Can I go over there and wait? I could stay outside of her room if that's okay with you. Nurse Lee, take her. Director Bai instructed the nurse. Thank you. Her eyes gleamed with unspoken gratitude. Director Bai? Just as he was about to say something else, a voice sounded from the background. Given the urgency threaded across the man's tone, Director Bai immediately said his goodbyes and went straight to the operating room. Jianyun could only watch the double doors slam shut again, remembering the 3-hour anxiety that she had experienced a few minutes ago. Let's go. The nurse was kind. She immediately led Jianyun to the corridor facing the ICU. Knowing that she was worried, Nurse Lee comforted her all the way, even patting her on the shoulder, as if she was a long-time friend. Upon seeing Jianyun peering inside the entrance, she smiled sadly. You might not be able to see her because of the blinds, Nurse Lee explained, motioning to the bench. Why don't you sit here for a while? If you want anything, you can go to the nurse station and ask for me. I'll be here as quick as I can. Thank you. Nodding, she sat down. She sat there for 3 straight hours. If she wasn't playing with her phone, she was counting the cracks on the ceiling. At this point, all she could do was wait and hope that her mother would wake up soon. Jianyun trailed her fingers across her jeans as she gazed through the glass windows. Once Wu Wenjing had finally sent Auntie Chin to the room that Jianyun had rented for the night, she rushed back to the hospital almost immediately. As she was approaching the corridor, she could see her friend sitting almost motionlessly on the bench with her eyes fixated on the ICU. She shook her head and sighed. Chapter 94, Bays. Jianyun, why don't you head back and rest? Wu Wenjing tried to persuade her. I just asked the nurse back at the counter, and they said that you're still not allowed to visit for 48 hours. If anything happens during this period, the hospital could contact you instead. Let's just go home and get you to sleep, okay? However, Jianyun didn't respond. Instead, she simply stared at the glass windows, as if her voice was another passing blow of the wind. Her hands lay on her lap, fidgeting around the stray threads of her jeans as she desperately tried to keep it together. However, the longer she had sat there, the more agitated she became. Wu Wenjing sighed. If you don't eat or drink, your body will collapse sooner or later, she wanted. If that happens before Auntie wakes up, who will take care of her then? Before you take care of her, it's best if you start taking better care of yourself, okay? Please? I am scared, she finally admitted, turning to look at Wu Wenjing. Although her face was impassive, there was a sense of fear hidden in the depths of her bright eyes. Although the doctor had stated over and over again that the operation was a success, she still felt uneasy. And that anxiety couldn't be mitigated until she could see her mother's calm face. What are you so afraid of? The nurse already said that Director Bai is one of the best in the country. If he said that the operation was successful, then it is. We should be going home. Not wanting to say anything further, she grabbed a hold of Jianyun's hand and took a step forward, going farther and farther from the ICU. Her friend was right. Of course, she was. But the thought of her mother's pale face and blue lips as she lay alone in that hospital bed struck her senseless. Stopping, Jianyun pulled herself from Wu Wenjing's grip, shaking her head. Let me stay here, she convinced. Besides, it's not like I could sleep well tonight if I go back. Then how about I'll stay with you in the hospital? You still have work tomorrow, Jianyun stated, pushing her away. This was just an obstacle she had to face alone, and she didn't want anyone to be bothered by this burden. After all, they all had their own respective problems. She didn't want to just toss another one into their baskets. Biting her lips, she proceeded to hug her knees and stare. I really can't do anything with you, huh? Wu Wenjing sighed in frustration. However, she knew for a fact that there was no way she could convince her friend at this state. She had accompanied her in the ICU for a while before she finally stood up. Fine. Call me if there's anything you need, okay? I'm here for you, Yun. We're all here for you. After walking a few steps, she turned around. Wait, did you call your father? Jianyun froze for a moment before shaking her head. It had been a long time since she had contacted him. And it was definitely before Lin Lanlan and Lin Rong started showing up in their lives again, like a bunch of maggots. The light in her eyes had faded even more, and it seemed as if the artificial lights all around them had dimmed. You shouldn't shoulder such a big problem alone, okay? Wu Wenjing patted her shoulder. You should at least tell him what's going on. Jianyun could only nod in response. Once her friend had finally left the premises, she took out her phone, scrolling through her contacts. Although she had plenty of relatives, she didn't know who to call first, especially after such a predicament. Her grandparents were already so old. If they knew something had happened to their daughter, they would be worried sick. Clutching the phone, she shook her head and scrolled down. Her first uncle's wife and her mother didn't have a good relationship, given their headstrong personalities, and her first uncle had always been afraid of his wife. Not wanting to find them, she scrolled down, stopping when she saw her father's name. A bitter smile slipped into her lips. Remembering her mother's words, she squeezed her eyes shut, not even wanting to think about contacting him. At this point, her other uncle was the last one on her contact list. After the call, Jianyun stood up and walked towards the window of the ward. Although she couldn't see anything besides the curtains and the blinders, she didn't really care. The longer she stood there, the closer she felt to her mother. And that was all that counts. The night was getting late, and she shifted on her cold seat. Although the weather was warm in the day, it was quite chilly once the sun had set, and the air conditioning system around here wasn't making it any better. All she could do was hug her arms around her chest and squeeze her eyes shut, as darkness had enveloped her in his arms. When she woke up again, she felt a large blanket wrapped around her body. It had the hospital's name on it, threaded across the corners of her lips raised upwards. It must have been given to her by one of the nurses in the station. Jianyun glanced at her watch. It was already 4 a.m. It was exceptionally quiet in the hospital, without the bustling sound of wheelchairs and hospital beds rushing back and forth across the corridors. The hairs at the back of her neck stood in response, and she tightened the grip she had around the fabric. Dawn had finally arrived, and she saw some of the interns making their usual rounds. Thinking that it was time to wake up, Jianyun folded up the blanket and knocked on the door of the nurse's station. "Come in," a voice called out. She pushed the door open and saw a few nurses lounging in their respective areas. She handed them the blankets with a smile. "Thank you for lending me one of your blankets." "A blanket?" A nurse turned around to check their storage area. Frowning, she shook her head. "We don't lack any blankets here." "That isn't ours, dear." "Then who lent me the blanket last night?" A plumper nurse came over to take a closer look. Leaning over, she sniffed at its edges before a slow smile spread across her features. "This is from Director Bai's stock," she later explained. "I could tell it from the scent alone. After working for him for a couple of years, I have quite an impression of him, you know." "Director Bai?" Jianyun blinked, surprised. Wasn't he the same doctor who had operated on her mother yesterday? He was the one who had covered her with the blanket. Our Director Bai is quite a looker, and he's exceptionally kind to every patient he comes across. The nurses giggled, evidently enamored by him. His office is just by the end of the corridor. You could go ask around if ever you get lost. I'm sure every single one of those nurses is willing to help you find him. Thanking them one last time, she walked towards Director Bai's office after some thought. After all, he was the one who had lent her the blanket. It would be rude if she didn't return it to him. Jianyun was about to knock on the door when a man in a white coat had opened it from the inside. She had almost bumped into him if she hadn't stopped herself immediately. Flushing in embarrassment, she took a step back. "May I ask if Director Bai is here?" The man paused and smiled. "I'm Director Bai. It's a pleasure to meet you." "I'm sorry, what?" She blinked, staring at the young man in disbelief. "You're Director Bai? The one who had just operated on my mother? That Director Bai? Don't I look like a doctor?" He raised his eyebrows teasingly. "Ah, no, it's not that." Snapping out of her daze, she hurriedly shook her head. The last time Jianyun had seen him was back at the operating room when he was wearing a mask. Although he had removed it while he was talking to her, she wasn't paying any attention as to what he had looked like. Actually, she had just assumed that given he was an expert, he must have been in his late 40s. She didn't think that Director Bai would be a man in his early 30s. His appearance was quite clean-shaven, with clear eyes and a narrow nose. Although he didn't look particularly handsome at first glance, he did look quite put together. And with his refined temperament, it was no wonder that his patients were comfortable being under him. Her shoulders visibly relaxed, and she chewed on her bottom lip. "I thought." Not wanting to say any more, she sheepishly smiled and passed the blanket over to him. "I heard from one of the nurses that this is your blanket. Thank you for lending it to me." "Do you think I'm some bald old man?" Director Bai said playfully, taking the blanket from her hands. Although he didn't admit it, it was obvious that he was the one who had covered her. Giggling, she shrugged. "I bet I'm not the only one who thinks that way." "That's true," he agreed. Opening the door a bit wider, he stepped to the side. "Why don't you come inside?" Jianyun stuck her head and saw that there was another female doctor in her early 30s lounging in his office. With a nod, she slowly walked into the brightly lit room. The white walls were definitely a contrast to the spark of color from the wooden tables and cabinets, making the atmosphere somewhat familiar to her rather than intimidating. Placing the blanket on one of the tables, Director Bai poured her a cup of water. Jianyun glanced at the name tag on his chest before raising her eyebrows in surprise. "Bai Zhe, you're actually named after the beast in the legends who ward of diseases back in the day," she spouted almost immediately. It was when she said that did she realize that how she had worded her sentences? Perhaps calling someone a beast wasn't the best compliment she could give to the man who had just operated on her mother. Ducking her head in embarrassment, she rubbed the back of her neck. I didn't mean to call you a beast. All I'm saying is that..." "Well, you aren't wrong," Bai Zhe interjected, laughing. "In fact, our Director Bai here knows practically everything about a patient's ailments with just one look. He could be even better than that beast itself." The female doctor winked at them, turning her head. "That's probably why he's the face of our neurology department. His mortality rate is 0 to none, and we can definitely assure that every patient under his grasp would receive the best care available." Perhaps he could be Bai's reincarnation. Who's to say? All three of them burst into laughter. Because of the joke, the atmosphere around them had immediately loosened up. Even Jian Yun found herself leaning against the chair, feeling her own nerves starting to unwind after the long night she just had. I just did my morning rounds, and your mother's vital signs are quite stable. Sitting in front of her, Bai Zhe tapped his fingers onto the table. Why don't you go home and rest? Don't be so hard on yourself. It was then when Jian Yun had managed to look into his gentle eyes. Although his stare was quite calming, it actually had the power to assure and convince others. It took her a while before she nodded. All right. Chapter 95, Despair. Jian Yun had only left the hospital once she was sure that Auntie Chin had arrived safely. After that, she quickly went home. It was obvious that the hard bench was clearly not a place for sleeping, and her eyelids were practically drooping the moment she had opened her bedroom door. As soon as her back hit the mattress, she immediately fell asleep. Snuggling under the covers, darkness quickly shrouded all around her as she ignored the blaring light creeping up her windowsill. She had stayed in this position for over an hour until a phone call had interrupted her nap. Jumping out of bed, she grabbed the phone from her bedside table. Hello? Yun Duo. It's me. Ouyang Beicheng, her mother's younger brother, spoke from the other end of the line. Before she could speak, she heard faint sounds of explosions from the background, and her frown deepened. It was soon followed by hundreds of footsteps racing farther from him. Uncle, she asked worriedly, are you okay? Where are you? I've been relocated for a temporary mission, so I might not be there in the meantime, he responded quickly. His deep voice overshadowed the faint noises, but she could tell that he had just come from a sprint, given that he was still panting. With a sigh, he continued, I've already transferred 50,000 yuan to you, to help with your mother's hospital expenses. I hope that's good for now. It is. Stay safe, okay? Ouyang Beicheng had worked in the army ever since he was still a young man, so she was already familiar with the noises in the background whenever he called over. In addition to that, he held plenty of responsibility, being one of the frontliners of their safety. Even if she was disgruntled that he couldn't come, it wasn't as if she could do anything about it. I have something else to do, so I'll be hanging up first, okay? I'll call you when I'm free tonight, he stated. Jian Yun could hear someone calling him from the background, but before she could say her goodbyes, her uncle had already hung up. Her heart stirred uneasily in her chest, and the grip she had on her phone tightened even more. It seemed that right now, she had two people she needed to worry about. Scrunching her toes onto the rug, she squeezed her eyes shut. The only thing she could do now was pray for both their safety. Her grandmother had given birth to her uncle Beicheng when she was in her very late 30s. Since he and Ouyang Fei were practically 10 years apart, they didn't really have the opportunity to bond like siblings. However, he and Jian Yun, on the other hand, had gotten along very well. He was always the first one to stand up for her, and he had always taken care of her all these years, especially after the accident. Jian Yun had originally thought that as long as he could come, she could have a sense of strength to lean onto. Now that he wasn't there, she could only rely on herself for the meantime. She sat on the bed in a daze. Glancing at the time, she saw that it was already 3 p.m. I couldn't sleep at this rate, she told herself, planning to go to the hospital after washing up. At this point, she didn't know what else she could do besides that. It seemed that this was the only way her body could function. Once she was already dressed up, she tied her hair up and grabbed her bag. However, just as she was about to leave her room, her phone rang out once again. This time, it was a call directly from the hospital. Is this Ouyang Fei's family? Hurry, come to the hospital. The voice on the phone sounded very urgent, but before she could ask any more questions, he hung up immediately. Her heart plummeted to her stomach. Did something happen to my mom? Were the medications not working? Was the operation not successful? So many thoughts rushed to the back of her mind that she couldn't bring herself to eat anymore. Without another thought, she slung her bag over her shoulders and sprinted out of her apartment. Unshed tears blurred her vision as she waved her hand for a taxi. She'll be fine. She'll be fine, she repeated to herself over and over again, clutching onto her bag for dear life. However, even then, she still found it hard to believe herself. Once she had arrived in the ICU, Auntie Chin was the first one to welcome her. Yun, you're finally here. Auntie, what's going on? Jian Yun grabbed onto her frail hand, squeezing tightly. I'm not sure either. Director Bai still hasn't shown up yet, so I've been waiting here for the past couple of minutes. Even Auntie Chin was at a loss for words. She looked from either side of the hallway, seemingly at a loss for what to do as well. Seeing this, Jian Yun had no other choice but to head over to the doctor's office and knock on the door, wanting to ask more questions regarding her mother's situation. However, just as she was about to knock, one of the doctors walked right out. He looked like a man in his 40s. Holding a clipboard close to his chest, his eyes immediately narrowed. How are you related to Ouyang Fei? Ouyang Fei is my mother. Her hands were already trembling. Doctor, is my mother. The doctor frowned. Did your mother suffer from any previous trauma? She had fallen from the stairs 6 years ago. She fractured her spine, and around 2 of her thoracic vertebrae were broken. Her spleen was completely torn off from the incident. She reiterated the painful memories as if it had just happened yesterday. Even as she told the doctor, she still couldn't believe that her mother had suffered through so much hardships in the past. Her voice trembled at the thought. It would be best if you could get me all the medical records from that incident. We might need them for further consultation. The male doctor stopped walking and turned to her. Also, Wu Yangfei's condition is still somewhat complicated, so you must prepare yourself for the expenses. If there are any complications, the situation she's in right now may be more dangerous. The cost could be quite high. How much does she need for the operation then? The doctor was about to be called away by one of the nurses when he gave her one last answer. I'm not sure, but prepare around 400,000. At the number given, Jian Yun had collapsed onto the chair, feeling as if all the strength had been sucked away from her body. Her fingers lay flat onto the metal bench, and her eyes squeezed shut. No matter how much she had struggled to wish for all these problems to go away, it seemed that the fates still wouldn't listen to her. This was her reality, and there was no escaping such tribulations. However, she was already running out of options. When her mother had been hospitalized yesterday, she had already given Wu Wenjing around 10,000 yuan. This morning, the nurse had told her that she needed to pay up another 50,000 yuan to support her mother's medication. Although she had saved up more than 200,000 yuan over the years, the amount still wasn't enough to support her at this rate. She needed to make more, but how could she make more in such a short span of time? It wasn't as if money could grow on trees. If she had been hospitalized in Boshan, her mother's medical insurance could still be used. However, Qinghu City and Boshan were in 2 different provinces, rendering her medical card void here. Even if Jian Yun could get the receipts reimbursed, they still needed to wait for her mother to be released by the hospital. But according to the doctor, her mother's condition was already very dangerous as it was. Being discharged so early clearly wasn't in the options. Her entire body felt cold, and she could only shiver and sniffle on the bench. Yun, do you not have enough money? Auntie still has several thousand yuan. You could use it first, Auntie Chin comforted. The old woman was frightened sick by the doctor's words. She could only blame herself for not taking good care of Ouyang Fei in the first place. At this point, she also sat beside her, not being able to stand up as she continually wiped the tears from her face. Auntie, I can still hold on to my money a little while longer, Jian Yun whispered. Unless it was absolutely necessary, she wasn't going to take Auntie Chin's money. After all, with her husband's condition, she might also need the cash to last a little while longer. Auntie Chin had left right after to clear out some documents. Even then, the more Jian Yun thought of the cash needed, the more frightened she became. She initially wanted Baizhe to clarify things regarding her mother's condition, but when she had tried asking around, the nurse only said that Director Bai was still tasked with doing the clinical rounds today. This time, all she could do was wait for his arrival. However, when 30 minutes had passed, she saw dozens of doctors and nurses rushing into the ICU. Your mother has shown signs of infection, and her vitals are failing her. The nurse had started quickly before she rushed into the room, with a bunch of needles in tow. That was the only thing Jian Yun could hear before her entire body had fallen limp. It was as if the world around her had stopped spinning, and she stumbled onto the ground, lifeless. When Wu Wenjing and Luo Yanyan had arrived, they discovered her curled up onto the ground with empty eyes and blue lips. She looked like a doll whose strings were cut, and they immediately rushed over. Yun, get up. Why are you sitting on the ground? The 2 women helped her to a chair and sat her down. However, no matter how many questions they've asked, Jian Yun still remained quiet. She stared blankly at the door directed to the ICU, not saying another word. Since Auntie Chin wasn't around to clarify the problem, Wu Wenjing and Luo Yanyan were extremely anxious. Please, Yun, tell us what happened. There was another old lady watching over her family members who had overheard the entire conversation. Not being able to take it anymore, she quickly reiterated to the 2 women what the doctor had just said. But how? Wu Wenjing cried out. Didn't Director Bai say that the operation was successful? We need to find Director Bai. At this point, Jian Yun could no longer think straight. Her mind was simply repeating the information she had heard this morning. The female doctor had said how Director Bai's operations were always a success, if not, mostly a success. Why would her mother suddenly fall ill now? Of all days? Had something happened? Gripping the sides of her seat, she could feel her heart racing in her chest from the anxiety. Just as she was about to get up and find him, the elevator opened. A refined man in a white coat walked out first, and she wasted no time in rushing over. Baizhe had been staring at the medical records that were handed over by the nurse that he didn't even notice Jian Yun. It was only when she stood right in front of him did he finally raise his head. Seeing her, the frown on his face had deepened. I was just about to look for you, he said, motioning for him to follow her. Follow me to my office. Jian Yun didn't say anything else as she followed him towards the doctor's office. Wu Wenjing and Luo Yanyan followed, supporting their friend with every step they take. Baizé poured a glass of water for Jian Yun and told her to sit down. Once everyone was settled in, he pushed the medical records towards her. Your mother's operation has been very successful. There's no doubt about that, he stated. But there have been complications regarding an infection, so now we have increased the number of dosages to prevent even more from rising. Will my mother die? Her lips quivered. So this was what despair felt like.